was pointed out to us that this country is a new country, the Russian Federation. It's only 27 years old. And of course it came after the Soviet Union, which fell in 1991 thanks to Gorbachev. And of course, many Russians are not happy about that because after the Soviet Union fell, there was an economic disaster. So many things that were state-owned were no longer operating and people were very poor. So Gorbachev was a mixed blessing to Russia, of course to the rest of the world to see communism fall and the Soviet Union dissolve, especially to those, not all those, but states in the Soviet Union that were essentially captive. Ken is back there. Let's try it. So this is like the boat that we were on, of just 100 passengers, called the Volga Dream. And I'm dividing this into 3 parts, so it'll last till next year or something. And this is the first part, because we spent 4 days in St. Petersburg, 4 days in Moscow at each end, and then 6 days on the boat. And it was a lovely boat, and I'm anxious to tell you about it, but that will be in August. But right now I want to tell you about St. Petersburg. I learned a tremendous amount of Russian history, considering that I knew practically nothing. So I want to pass that on to you. So you can see St. Petersburg in the very left-hand corner. It is almost in Finland, and you can see how huge Russia is and how small St. Petersburg is relatively, although about 4% of the population lives in St. Petersburg. I have to say I fell in love with the city, so you'll see a lot of things there. It took me the whole trip to figure out Russian history, these very simple 5 parts of Russian history, which I didn't understand before. We spent a lot of time in the remnants of imperial Russia, where the czars were, the Romanovs, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, that era. And that ended with the revolution of 1917. And you'll see a lot of things from that period. I'm not sure why, because they have carefully restored these dwelling places where the czars lived. So then the revolution started in 1917 and went until 1941, interrupted by World War II, which was very difficult for Russia, and especially for St. Petersburg. We'll talk about that. So then the Soviet era continued, which began in 1917, which involved the whole Soviet Union, all those different states that were part of the Soviet Union is what we're talking about. This doesn't sound like it's on at all. And that went till 1991 with Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Russian Federation in 1991 to now. So we're really talking about almost 4 different countries. This is one of the horrible things in St. Petersburg history when 1934, the communist leader of Leningrad, this used to be called Leningrad, St. Petersburg. He was assassinated, and Stalin was running the country and had a purge where 40,000 people were killed. That's only the small part of what Stalin did during his reign. This is the famous siege of Leningrad. I've heard about this for a long time, and I remember when I was in Minsk, I met a general, a man who was dressed as a general. He was a general during the siege of Leningrad. This was an 872-day siege, so we're talking more than 2 years, where the Nazis closed off all routes to food, to everything. And more than 1 million civilians died in St. Petersburg from starvation.
What year was that, Faye?
from 1941 to 1945. It was unspeakable when you read about it, and this is a real picture from it. And Putin welcomes you. I'm not talking much about Putin because I don't know enough about him, but maybe sometime. So St. Petersburg was founded by Tsar Peter the Great, who was a pretty good ruler in 1703. He died young at age 52, but he ruled from 1682 to 1785. And his thing was to westernize Russia. And you'll see from the architecture in St. Petersburg that he was very successful. But as most attempts to modernize things or change things, he met with a lot of opposition from the Russian nobility. And there were several attempts on his life, and they sort of made a fake treason case against his son. Pretty handsome dude. So St. Petersburg is the second largest city next to Moscow, with a population of 5 million people. Considering that Russia's a pretty big place, that's a lot of people. So there is a port on the Baltic Sea, and the Neva River runs through St. Petersburg. It's a very beautiful river. Oh, I said that already. Yeah. And it's the northernmost metropolis in the world, as you could see from that map before. It's quite north. Fortunately, when we were there, it wasn't that cold. It was pretty cold some of the time. When we looked out the window at the Hermitage, we could see the Neva River and these boats that go up and down. Catherine the Great, who was a very good ruler herself, made the banks of the Neva line them with granite embankments, so that protected them from erosion. And that was 1760, 1780.
She gave John Paul Jones syphilis.
So,
She gave John Paul
St.
Jones
Petersburg is
syphilis.
remarkable architecturally, and this is a little tour. Some of these pictures I copied from Google because my pictures were good, but not this good. This city of St. Petersburg has 221 museums, 2,000 libraries, more than 80 theaters, 100 concert organizations, 45 galleries and exhibit halls, 62 cinemas, and around 80 other cultural establishments. There's not too many cities you can say that about. It is the cultural center of the country. And you can see the architecture is quite remarkable. This has a Russian influence. Some of them are more European. It is a beautiful city with classic European style architecture, lots of Russian history all around, and lots of water all over. The Neva River, and there are other rivers too, as you'll see. When I was there before, it was during the Soviet Union, there were not very many, if any, private shops or restaurants. And now there's tons of them. The city has become a unique reserve of European architectural styles of the past 3 centuries. And again, you don't see that in many places, even in Europe. It's a typical street. The onion domes are starting in St. Petersburg, and you'll see more of them as we go further south. This is the Alexander Column commemorating the War of 1812, which Russia won against Napoleon. And a lot of things going on here of historic significance, including the Decembrist Revolution, which didn't work out. So first, Peter the Great named it St Petersburg, not no S in it. A German name, because he was very into German and French things. And then in 1914, in honor of him, when he died, it was named Petrograd, which takes the German out of it and makes it more Russian. And then after Lenin died in 1924, it was named after him and called Leningrad. And in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Empire, it was again named, not again, but now officially named St. Petersburg. And you may wonder, what's Stalingrad? Because there was a Stalingrad, which is now Volgograd, which is in the south somewhere. This is so beautiful when you see the onion domes combined with all the beautiful European style architecture. Look at that. Truly remarkable, I think. So in Moscow, many of the buildings have been torn down, but not in St. Petersburg. They have been preserved. The Baroque and neoclassical buildings of the 18th, 19th century look really good. And there are about 8,000 architectural monuments in Petersburg. You can see from this how beautiful and well preserved they are. So the Romanov dynasty was there, and the imperial court of the Russian czars, and the seat of the Russian government for 300 years until the revolution in 1917. Then the seat of the government was moved to Moscow. Both in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're very good at lighting the buildings at night. So going through the cities at night is really a treat. This is beautifully illuminated. This is a huge cathedral. It doesn't look like one, but that's what it is. And it's very nice how they preserve the open space around some of these buildings. So by the 1940s, neoclassical architecture given way to various Romanicist style, which dominated till the 1890s. And you can see some of these Romantic styles with their decorations. Even though Russia was very poor in the 1990s, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, not a single major theater or museum was closed in St. Petersburg. In fact, many new ones were built. This is one of the theaters. This is the Bolshoi Hall. We didn't go to the Bolshoi. Last time I was in St. Petersburg, the Bolshoi was in New York. And I saw the Uzbek ballet, which intrigued me so much I went to Uzbekistan a couple of years later. Obviously a very beautiful theater. Big organ there. When I was there last time, this must have been going on. It's now during the White Nights now. But then there's a special festival on the Neva. I think commemorating the revolution, I'm not sure. But when I was there, people were rushing through the streets to go down to the river. It was sort of like being in the middle of the revolution. It was very joyous, and I think this White Nights festival must have been going on then. This is the Hermitage, and how many of you been there?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's much bigger than I thought. And of course it includes the theater, the old Hermitage, the small Hermitage, and the Winter Palace, where the revolution occurred. All part of the current museum. So what we saw, what you'll see, is a small part of it, and unfortunately not so much the art museum. So tens of thousands of serfs died in building the city. That's when they had essentially slavery, but it was abolished in 1861 by Alexander II, who didn't keep his seat very long. So the revolution of 1905 began in St. Petersburg and spread rapidly, but the monarchy didn't end until the abdication of Nicholas II in 1917, after the February Revolution. And that's what ended the 300 years of Romanov rule. And that's when things changed drastically. Not always for the good, I can say. This is a little bit of a decorative Cyrillic alphabet. A little bit about Russian, probably more than you want to know, but obviously it's the official language of the Russian Federation, but it's also spoken in Belarus, Kazakhstan. I've got films on those places, and Kyrgyzstan. Been to all those places. And as well through Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, even though it's not the official language. And it was the de facto language of the Soviet Union, so all those other states spoke it. And even though 30 years have passed since the breakup of the Soviet Union, it's still spoken in many places. And I'm not sure about Israel and Mongolia. I don't quite understand. I mean, I know it's spoken in Israel. Certainly not the official language. So it uses a Cyrillic alphabet, which makes reading it a little complicated. This is the underground, which, as you know, the Russian underground is very famous for how lavish it is. This is the one in Leningrad, and was designed before the Second World War, opened in 1955, decorated with marble and bronze. But after Stalin's death in 1953, the ornamental excesses of the Stalin architecture were abandoned. So the other stations are not this elaborate, but this is what you see when you go down there. There's a lot of facts here, which I'm not going to go into, I think, except you may not know this. St. Petersburg has a large brewery and distillery industry, known as Russia's beer capital, which I would not have known that. So these people's names keep being mentioned in relation to St. Petersburg, and when you look at this list, it's really quite remarkable. Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Korsakov, Nabokov, Brodsky, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and these ballerinas, Pavlova, Nureyev, Baryshnikov. And Dostoevsky called it the most abstract and intentional city in the world. I'm not sure what that means, but it's remarkable that one city, that one country would produce writers, dancers, musicians of this caliber. This is, lest we just look at old architecture. This is now the Center for Robotics and Technical Cybernetics. And there are a lot of institutes of higher education in St. Petersburg, including St. Petersburg State, which has 32,000 undergrads, and a few other ones that are mentioned here. This is our hotel where they put us up. We didn't pick this hotel, but it was very nice.
Remember the name of it?
Belmont Grand Hotel Europe. On the second floor, like there's sort of like a tea room, something or other, which we enjoyed. And sometimes there was music there. Here we are having our tea. And the dining room was absolutely beautiful, and the breakfast, which we got included, was wonderful, lavish. There's my daughter amid this cornflakes, honeys and butters. Elegant. So there was caviar every day, and blini, and cheesecake, and omelets, of course, and much, much, much more. So the day was scheduled for us to go to the Hermitage, and they have food trucks there, and there was one on the way over there. Probably very good. I hadn't tried it. These are buildings on the way, and there it is. Looks different in the front than in the back. What's not obvious here is that there was a huge line to get in. And fortunately, our guide was able to have us pass by that line, but enormous line, people from all kinds of different countries. And people dressed up as it used to be. This guy in gold is a real person. So I showed you this before. So Catherine the Great founded the Hermitage Art Museum in 1764, and she had acquired a collection that's on permanent display now. So there are over 3 million items, but most of them are in storage. And even so, it's almost impossible. I can't remember exactly how many years going every single day it would take to see the whole museum, to see the whole Hermitage. Part of it is the museum. So there we are, and our guide. We had a lot of very interesting guides. She was not the most, but she was good.
Speak English?
Oh yes, all our guides spoke English, and very good English. So really what we saw was where the czars lived in their absolute opulence. There were sometimes so many people in one room you could barely find everybody. I mean, the people you were looking for.
I saw this.
So this is part of the art museum. It's not the part that I would have wanted to see, but there it is. So there's Catherine the Great when she was young. She presumably had an 18-inch waist, and she got bigger as she got older, which does happen to people. The one painting that was so memorable was Rembrandt's self-portrait. You saw part of this before. There were lots of steps, which exhausted me, so every time I could find a seat, I sat in it. Here's Peter the Great again, and you saw this before. There's without the people. So there's Rasputin. He was a devil of a guy. He was a Russian mystic and self-proclaimed holy man who befriended the family of Tsar Nicholas II, the last monarch of Russia, who was assassinated, by the way, and gained considerable influence. He was also assassinated, Rasputin, in 1916. A lot of bloody history in Russia. I don't remember any of these sidewalk cafes from when I was there during the Soviet Union, but there are a lot now, and they're very pleasant. Typical couple. I can't remember what this is, apparently a bakery. These Stalin-era apartments are really bleak. And I guess that's a department store underneath. I haven't translated what that means, except it's Moscow something. That was very popular art during the Stalinist era, you know, workers and hero soldiers. These are very nice apartments, and it's true most Russians do live in them. So that night we got to go to a folk show, which I think you'll enjoy.
Wow.
There's the steps leading up to it. It's a beautiful auditorium. I didn't put too much of anything in there, but this was not the only quartet that we saw, male quartets, and they were all wonderful. Bill snippets, sorry. Volunteer to try that. Yeah. So during intermission, there were things for sale, like these beautiful Matryoshka dolls.
Beautiful. I have
Matryoshka. Here's a whole array of them,
Oh, wow.
and also the headdresses that the dancers were wearing. And the couple dressed up in like they were in the imperial court. I think somehow the Russians still worship their imperial heritage.
If they didn't have it, they wouldn't have that period.
That was a big hit.
That's cute.
Like that show.
Yes.
It was fun. So, my daughter went home and I was a little hungry and I was exploring the places to eat. It was sort of fun to walk around St. Petersburg at night. Well, you'll see, it's very light out and seems very safe. So this was the first place I saw Burger King. I don't think so.
What?
And then past this concert hall with all these upcoming events, walls and walls full of things that are coming, dances and instrumentals and all sorts of things. So here's a coffee shop on the right, and people inside eating on the left. Looked like a very nice place. This was the Nevsky Prospect, the main street in St. Petersburg. And it's about 10 o'clock at night, everything is open. This is from the menu. The menu has all pictures in it, since there are a lot of tourists, of course, in St. Petersburg. Very helpful to have a menu like this. There's another couple eating in that restaurant.
Oh.
I went into one of them and had a very nice meal. So then I went souvenir shopping. This beautiful place was there. I'm not quite sure what this is. A lot of very modern Matryoshka dolls suspended by strings. The next day. We went to a village outside of St. Petersburg to see another castle complex. Recognize that? Laura's song from Dr. Zhivago.
Yeah, Laura.
I'll play it later. That, needless to say, was my daughter
I'll
Kamala.
tell you a story about that.
So here's another imperial estate. Again, extremely lavish and very well cared for. Lady dressed up. If you look at the back of her, it's me taking a selfie.
Oh.
And this beautiful fireplace made with Delft tiles, beautiful. These big palaces were not heated, so fireplace like this came in handy in St. Petersburg, which gets pretty cold. You can see the tiles. Again, another mob scene. Here we are, sneaking a picture in. There's Catherine again. Getting a little heavy. They talked about the cost of restoring all this. These castles were bombed by the Nazis during the war, and many of them were destroyed a lot, but they were restored. I'm just not sure why, but they were at great expense. This was a dinner place for the prince and his lady friend.
And now you can see why the czars were done away with.
Beautiful grounds here. The lilacs were blooming, which is lovely. And typically there were brides and grooms all over the place in the parks and everywhere. So there are a couple here. I think this was their private observatory. It's really beautiful. Okay. They put an end to it all. So Lenin lived from 1870 to 1924. He died pretty young. And after the revolution, he was head of Soviet Russia from 1917 to 1924, so just 7 years. And during his tenure, the Soviet Union became a one-party communist state. There's still a lot of statues of Lenin around, not so much of Stalin. No surprise. So Stalin lived a lot longer and was 1878 to 1953, and he led the Soviet Union, I got the dates wrong here, but
76.
for a long time as General Secretary of the Communist Party and Premier. It's estimated, if you go to Dr. Google and say how many people were killed during Stalin's time, the answer was 20 million. 20 million. Little decoration here. My daughter belongs to a group, and she found people from her group in St. Petersburg, and she found them. She took the subway and got herself there, and they took her back. And so these were 4 of her friends. They, between them, spoke about 10 words of English, and they were fun. We invited them to stay for dinner, but they didn't, but they were nice.
They, were your friends Russian?
Yes, they were all Russian.
Very nice.
So, surprisingly, I don't know why, there's a topless show every night. This is just parenthetical, but when I got to Russia, I realized that I had never seen so many white people together in one place. And that was the case of the whole trip until we got to London, or even less, little less in Moscow. So, that's what they look like. There was a museum of emotions, which we didn't go into, but it looked like fun. I don't know how your Cyrillic is coming along, but that's pretty hard to read, isn't it? Georgian restaurants are very popular in St. Petersburg. How many of you have been to a Georgian restaurant? Well, I highly recommend one on El Cajon Boulevard called the Pomegranate, about Texas Street, around Texas Street. The food's really good. Our guide said that a lot of restaurants which weren't really Georgian called themselves Georgian just so people would come in. This one was really nice. There they are, young people enjoying themselves. Delicious dumplings. How many? And these, since my daughter's a vegetarian, these are all vegetarian dishes that we found on the menu. It was delicious. Borscht in the lower bottom, we had plenty of borscht. Borscht originated in Ukraine. If you want really good Ukrainian borscht, you go up the street, up Regent's Road to the European Deli, and they have Ukrainian borscht, which you can get any time practically. It's very good. You can sit there and eat it. And again, the menu has pictures in it so you know what you're ordering. So St. Petersburg has many nicknames, but one of them is called the City of White Nights because of a natural phenomenon which arises due to the closeness to the polar region and ensures that in summer, the nights of the city do not get completely dark for a month. And we were there for that month. I love it. I just love it. Walking around at midnight and it's not quite dark. This is about 10 o'clock at night. It happened to be cold. It got warmer later, but it was cold. And young people are out, and there's music playing in some of these old classic buildings that you see. The Black Caps were out too. Fortunately, not superstitious. So I went shopping for souvenirs and found all these really strange things. I was very tempted to get him, but I didn't. I think you saw this before. Nice little tank to take home would be nice. These are all soaps. So this is a little like taxi cab that you could take, I guess.
You drive it yourself?
I think so. So somewhere along the way, I developed a bad cough, and I'm always worried about pneumonia. So my daughter went to her cell phone and found the American Medical Clinic, and we took maybe an Uber over there. And if you wonder what that was like, this is how the waiting room is. This is a physician's assistant that we first saw who did the vitals. This is my doctor, who was really lovely. She's not nearly as solemn as she looks. She was a little surprised when I took her picture. But she was really nice, very nice and very competent.
What'd you give it?
She gave me antibiotics and said I had bronchitis. And this is the waiting room. So it was $81 with the antibiotics and the visit. And this is where you pay. And it's not pronounced caca, it's pronounced kasha. Well, as in cashier, so just want you to know that. So then we went out on the streets and we saw Superman. So my oxygen concentrator wasn't working when I got there. She said, you should really have one. So she gave us the name of an oxygen concentrator store, and we went over there. And the saleswoman did not speak any English. So we had a little trouble communicating, but presumably these were all oxygen concentrators. And we picked the one at the top right because of the color, I guess. I don't know. The directions were in Russian. We couldn't make out what she was telling us, but at least I had one. And we carried it around for several days, weeks, whatever. And I still use it now. It works. Maybe with balloons. I just plug it in. I have a Russian plug, so I, adapt it. Can you read that?
McDonald's.
McDonald's. Some things are easier to read than others.
Certainly.
So then we had, we met our group for this outing, and
0 calories.
it got very warm, hot even. And there was this nice Coke stand. And what happened here now? So this is an important village. I sat this one out because I was pretty tired and hot. But all these pretty buildings were there. So my daughter had a little corn on the cob, and so did she. A little more dainty about it. And we noticed a lot of people half-dressed, or not even half-dressed, who were sunning themselves because it had been pretty cool, and now it was pretty hot. Some of the buildings there. It's sort of a big tourist place, this, and I think these were all women from China who were paying very close attention to what their guide was telling them, in Chinese, of course. That means goodbye. So as we were driving to our boat, we saw these apartments on the outskirts of the city, quite decorative, very much like what you see in Tirana, Albania. And then these apartments, which are not so decorative. Equal opportunity worker. Strawberry truck. So from the 1950s to the 1980s, over 500,000 low-income families eventually received free apartments. Not so wonderful because they were collectives, and you had to, if there weren't enough to go around, you had to share your apartment with other people.
Yeah.
And about an additional 100,000 condos were purchased and given away to the people free. Well, economic and social activity is concentrated in the historic city center of St. Petersburg, which is the richest part of people, richest part of the city. Most people live in these commuter areas outside of the town. So this is the end of part one. I have a better picture of that.
You want a tour, Faye?
This is the Volga Dream, by the way. I was, yeah, let's turn the lights on and we can discuss it. Lights.
What? Oh, I thought you wanted to get the lights on. Yeah, she does.
It's good.